Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing Netflix's coverage of the Menendez case. Their first attempt, Monsters, was hailed as a pornographic, traumatic nightmare. By his own admission, Ryan Murphy did not consult Eric nor Lyle, and even goes on to say they should thank him for putting their case on the map. The new documentary is much better, and it feels like almost a fail-safe, like they had this as an emergency exit for when Monsters would be dubbed a disaster. The documentary adds some much-needed context to a series filled with lies. On a side note, there are certain aspects of the series that I really appreciated. First, the performances were unbelievable, and had they just stuck to the facts, it could have been a classic. The series does do a good job of playing on the title of the anthology, Monsters, specifically this tension between victim and perpetrator. It asks, to what extent does an individual's trauma mitigate or justify their actions? Now, although it poses this question, it just doesn't do a very good job of answering it. One of the biggest issues with the series was the tone. Unlike Dahmer, which was relentless, it was exhausting, it never really gave you a break. Lyle and Eric Menendez, the way they were portrayed, like there were moments in the series that were really funny and lighthearted when they really should not have been.
Well, let me tell you the number one thing I'm concerned about. Is that a sauna? No, Eric. It's a gas chamber.
Also made them look really dumb, like these two young boys who don't know any better, who kill their parents and think they're going to get away with it. It also over-sexualized the brothers and leaned into rumors which were created at that time to belittle their suffering and justify their sentence. Now, the documentary tries to bridge this gap. First, I'm very happy that it's not a docu-series. You can say what you need to say in 2 hours. We don't need 10 episodes. And I also really appreciated how the documentary was told from Eric and Lyle's perspective. They are the ones driving the story. The documentary uses photos as well as footage from the Menendez household and clips of that era. It also interviews family members, friends, jurors, experts, like all kinds of people except for one raggedy woman, who all agree that the brothers should not have been in jail for this long. I thought watching the case again while listening to Eric and Lyle recollect their memory of this time period was really effective in highlighting how they were not just victims of their parents, but really victims of their era. And I appreciated how we only heard their voices. We don't actually see Eric or Lyle until the end of the documentary. And it does a good job of trying to put you in their shoes in this era, because it's easy to sit back and say, oh wow, like I don't see how this could have happened. But honestly, it was a different time period. Like in this video, I will discuss aspects of the documentary I enjoyed and compare them to the series where I feel it's appropriate. First thing I appreciated about the documentary is how it explains the differences between Eric and Lyle's personalities. In this series, Lyle really got the short end of the stick. He's made out to be this American psycho. One of the reasons they became suspects in the first place is because of their erratic behavior, specifically their insane shopping sprees. And the series made it look like they were celebrating their kills, and worse, Lyle had absolutely no empathy. In the documentary, Lyle explains this time period and these shopping sprees, and he explains that he was in utter turmoil. More so than that, Eric goes on to say that he was absolutely shocked that they weren't arrested because they were covered in gunshot residue. In some ways, their privilege was a benefit and it did protect them, because the Beverly Hills police detectives couldn't exactly interrogate or search two wealthy young men on the night of their parents' murder without the entire neighborhood being very upset with them. So the police had to tread very carefully. It's not that wealthy, good-looking people cannot commit murders. It's just they shouldn't be your first suspects, and that's kind of the attitude in this area of America at this time. Besides their shopping spree, the brothers became overachievers like literally overnight. Lyle in particular really wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. He wanted to become a successful entrepreneur. And a number of experts in the documentary note how the brothers spoke very highly of Jose. That's because he literally shaped them in his image. The psychological hold Jose had over this family made it impossible for them to leave. And I think that's what I loved about Javier Bardem's performance. Like, you could feel it. He not only physically abused his children, but he financially abused them. And this is a man who had plans to run for office and become a political figure. So there's no way he's letting his sons out of his sight, because they could expose him one day. And the idea that they could just leave because they were adults, it doesn't really work when someone's been physically and financially torturing you since you were a young child. In the documentary, Eric explains how he was patiently waiting for his freedom. He really believed that once he got to college, everything would be fine. And his father turned the tables on him, informing him not only is he not moving to go to college, but he is staying in that house. This was not a man that was ever going to let his children go easily. And he really was an extreme narcissist who got off on controlling and victimizing people, his sons in particular. Now, a part of the reason they were so reluctant to speak about their trauma is because they didn't want to ruin their parents' reputation. And even in this series, it is shown that this is not a defense they leaned into, even though it would have garnered them a huge amount of sympathy before the trial started. And it probably would have given them more options when it came to defense lawyers. Like, they were very limited. No one wanted to defend them because no one really believed anything that they were saying. Now, the defense did not argue that their abuse led to the murders. Instead, they laid out a series of events that occurred, made the brothers believe that their lives were in danger. Lyle found out that his father was still abusing Eric and confronted him, and this confrontation did not go well. And to add insult to injury, they also discovered that their mother was in on it the entire time. There's a scene in the series where Chloe Sevigny, who plays Kitty extremely well, like, she ate up that role. And she kind of looks at Eric and she says, like, do you think I'm stupid? Basically informing, like, yes, I've known this entire time. And this piece of information made them a lot more paranoid than they already were. Now, listening to Eric and Lyle describe their fear is one thing, but when you listen to the jurors, the lawyers, the experts, all basically say, yes, we believe we're really in fear for their lives, it's pretty astonishing considering how they were basically guilty even before the trial started. One juror explains how even before she found out she would be sitting for the Menendez case, like, in her mind, they were guilty. It was very black and white. They killed them, that's it. Why do we even need a trial? The fact that they believe them despite the overwhelming negative media coverage, it does say a lot. It means that the evidence was so overwhelming that it was enough to change enough of their minds. One aspect of the documentary I enjoyed were all these savage clips from talk shows and celebrities making fun of the brothers, because it really explains why the jury was split according to gender. Society was very reluctant and still very reluctant to see men as victims, let alone use their trauma as a mitigating factor to justify their actions. And you see that in the Diddy case with the amount of memes and tweets making fun of certain rappers for being preyed on by Diddy. I thought the portrayal of their lawyer, Leslie, was really excellent. And it's very sad that they couldn't interview her for this documentary, because I would have loved to hear her perspective at that time and now, because she was one of the most interesting characters in this entire saga. The sad part is, having two strong women defend them, it probably made their case a lot harder to win. One of my favorite scenes in the series is when Leslie pulls aside a number of jurors and asks what could they have done better, especially since they were going into a second trial. And one of the jurors informs her that actually a lot of the men just didn't want to give you the win. They just didn't like you very much. It's sad to say, but if they had male representation with the same argument, they probably would have gotten the lesser charge. And this case was upsetting for a number of reasons, because it was a lot easier to buy two rich boys killing their parents for money than what it really was. Jose did not look like a monster. His sons did not look like victims. When we're looking at all the clips and all the family photos, I mean, they were a beautiful family. From the outside looking in, they really looked like the American dream. Jose's story is fantastic on paper. He escaped Cuba after the revolution and built an empire from scratch. Like, he was a massive businessman who had dreams of becoming a politician. And his love story, it's actually not that far off in how it's portrayed in the series. When he met Kitty, she was a very ambitious, beautiful young woman who had dreams of stardom herself until she married this monster that abused her and her children. And I think when you look at this family and then when you find out what was going on behind the scenes, a lot of Americans had difficulty reconciling how someone could be a monster and a victim. Like, either you're a monster and you had it coming, or you're a victim that deserves justice. Like, the two just couldn't coexist in the same space. And one of the things the series does very well, I think, is it gives Jose this backstory. And even though he may have been abused when he was younger, it still doesn't justify his actions. And then there's this issue of like nature versus nurture. Like, was Jose made to be a monster, or was he born a monster? And by all accounts, he was just a monster. Like, this is someone that was just pure evil from beginning to end. And I thought it was very telling that the only witness they could find that could say anything good about him was his secretary, someone that probably had minimal contact with him outside of the workplace. And Jose is one thing, but the mother is another thing, because prior to meeting Jose, it doesn't seem like she was a bad person. And then as soon as she met him, she kind of became as depraved as he was. And whether or not she always had that in her is something that the series tries to explore. And one of my favorite aspects of the documentary is when Eric and Lyle are explaining their relationship to their mother. And in some ways, she was far worse than Jose, because she basically stood back and let this man abuse her sons. Like, she wasn't much of a mother to begin with. And the reason they killed her is as a euthanasia, because killing Jose was like killing her. This aspect of the mother, I think, blew a lot of minds, because it's one thing for the father to be doing it, but then to try to explain to the public, like, oh, the mother, like a mother refusing to protect her children, and not only refusing to protect her children, basically feeding her sons to this wolf, is just something that a lot of people didn't want to look in the eye. And I think in so many ways, having this case on TV turned it into such a spectacle. It turned it into such a nightmare. The Menendez case was the first celebrity case to be aired on television, and it was the first time that Americans could watch true crime. And because it was rooted in spectacle, people watched it like it was reality TV and not real life, like people's real lives being like, this has serious consequences. And rather than use this as an opportunity to educate people about the law and the nuances of the law, the media used it as content for entertainment. One of the craziest moments in the series, and even in the documentary, is when we find out about this Dr. Oziel. And the series actually made him look a lot better than he deserved. Like, this man was an opportunistic monster. And the series made it seem like he was very empathetic towards the boys, and the reason that he was recording the conversations was as a failsafe, but really he wanted to unpack their trauma. And according to Lyle, that was not the case. This man didn't give a damn about them at all, and he essentially just blackmailed them into these recordings. On top of that, he was an assailant. He abused a number of his clients. Like, he is a whole nother issue, and it's no wonder that he was able to connect with Jose, because they were basically two sides of the same coin. And when you think about how these recordings were taken, it makes you wonder how they were even admitted into evidence, because the jury doesn't actually hear these tapes until the end of the trial, which for me indicates how desperate the prosecution was. Like, they didn't know how this case was going to go. Like, it was 50-50. They tried to simplify it, but because it was so complicated and because there were so many factors involved, the jury just didn't know what to do with itself. I think one of the most jarring things about this case is how it sparked absolutely no conversation about male sexual abuse. Instead, they used this as content and made fun of it. You look at all these SNL skits, like, it's quite savage. And the public had trouble wanting to believe that these were abuse victims. And the reality is, abuse has no type. It doesn't matter where you're from, what you look like, what your tax bracket is. And honestly, the only difference between people who get away with it and those who don't is money. Aside from the victims themselves, again, it was very difficult for people to see Jose as a monster, because what would that say about his sons? But it was also the nature of the crime itself. Like, it was so gruesome. Like, maybe had they killed them in some other way, maybe if they poisoned them or set them up in some other manner, or even if they hired someone else to do it, but they are the ones who took a shotgun and slaughtered their parents like they were nothing, like they were animals. And I was really taken aback in the series when they showed it, because I was in shock myself. And I think what the series was communicating was they definitely deserved it, because they just showed it to us. And the series does not censor a single thing. And obviously times have changed, but in that era, a victim was a victim. It doesn't matter what they have done. Like, we cannot see them in any other way. Like, either you're a perpetrator or you're a victim. And this issue of perpetrator and victim is another aspect the series tries to unpack, and through the character of Dominic Dunn and the murder of his daughter, Dominique Dunn. Now, this case was quite unfortunate because his family suffered a grave injustice. His daughter was brutally murdered by her ex, and the defense in that trial basically argued that he had acted in a heat of passion because he was lied to by his ex-girlfriend, who made it seem like they were getting back together. And when he realized that that was not the case, he acted instinctively. Now, the problem is he strangled her for several minutes. So this was not in a heat of passion. Like, this is a man that was always going to kill this woman. As a result, he was never convicted of first-degree murder. He wasn't even tried for first-degree murder. And this case affected Dominic to the point where he dedicated his life to victims and their families. And the Lyle and Eric Menendez case really struck a nerve for him, because, like most Americans, he just couldn't really reconcile the two. Because if Jose was as bad as they're saying he was, then what does that make Eric and Lyle, right? They're also victims. They may be perpetrators, but they're also victims here. And again, the evidence was so overwhelming. Like, everyone put on the stand basically explained what a terrible human being this was. Individuals that were very familiar with Jose essentially said this man had it coming. Like, either someone was going to kill him or he was going to kill someone. Like, he was just a very possessive, psychotic human being. And I like that the documentary explained the defense that Eric and Lyle were using, like imperfect self-defense. Because the first trial, for better or worse, at least gave jurors the option to consider everything in this case, like everything leading up to the murder, not just the murder itself. Imperfect self-defense was appropriate for the brothers because they really believed their life was in danger. Now, whether or not their lives were actually in danger from an outsider's perspective is irrelevant. The jury just needed to believe that Eric and Lyle honestly believed it, like their fear was coming from an honest place. And it's hard to look at all the evidence and think it wasn't. I think it's very important for the state to make sure that you give jurors the options. Like, it might be very complicated, it might be a nightmare, but you do need to look at every case differently. Not everything is just black and white. And I thought the fact that it was a mistrial, like the fact that the jury couldn't agree, really spoke to how much evidence was in favor of the brothers. Now, the second trial was the state getting revenge. The state had essentially been humiliated by O.J. Simpson, and they were looking for a win any means necessary. Even in the show, you get very angry watching the second trial. The first issue is it wasn't aired on television. Now, granted, it had lost popularity over the years, but I think people still would have tuned in, and they would have had a lot to say about how this trial was conducted. The second issue is the judge, who basically said battered woman syndrome does not apply to men, making it impossible for the defense to include foundational evidence that the jury needed to hear to contextualize why the brothers acted in the way that they did. The state essentially succeeded in oversimplifying a very complicated case. They made it very black and white. Either you convict them of first-degree murder or they walk. And so the jury had no choice but to convict, because they were not given the necessary options to consider the context of this case. It's all they could focus on was the murder itself. And as a result, there's not much they could do. And watching the clips at that time of Leslie just shouting from a rooftop, like begging for help, was really sad, because she was screaming, but nobody was listening, because at this point, everyone had moved on from Lyle and Eric. And because it wasn't aired on television, no one really cared. And as a result, they were convicted. And the manner in which they were convicted was just, the state essentially made an example out of them and succeeded. And to add insult to injury, they separated them for decades. One of the saddest moments in the documentary is when Eric and Lyle describe agreeing to a Barbara Walters interview as a last-ditch attempt to stay together. Lyle apparently went on a hunger strike, like really had no mercy when it came to the brothers. Now, no one can make up for the humiliation they suffered. However, we can learn from it. And the best way I can summarize my thoughts is through Eric's eulogy in this series about his mother being a kind and loving person. In the eulogy, he explains that they had this big window in their house that birds would constantly fly into, and his mother, being this caring and loving person, would scoop up these birds, heal them back to health, and watch them fly away. In reality, we know that she was a monster who would shoot birds any chance she got. Like, this was not a woman who cared about anything. The reality is Kitty and Jose Menendez clipped their children's wings, preventing them from ever being able to fly on their own. I think one of the reasons people are so bothered by this case is because the sentence implies that Jose and Kitty Menendez were victims. Like, nothing that they did to their sons justifies what happened to them. Like, they played no part in their son's actions. And in some ways, the sentence absolved them of all the horrible things that they did to their sons. And to make matters worse, it kind of protected their legacy. It kind of protected their image, when in fact it should have been torn down and destroyed. Like, these were monsters who tortured their sons, held them hostage. And it was only a matter of time before Jose was going to kill them, because a man like this was just never going to let them go. Overall, I think the documentary is worth watching. Normally, I hate it when we revisit old cases because there's so many other cases we could revisit. But in this case, I do think it's appropriate, very timely, in fact. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.